What's going on, guys? We are back. The RLCS North American Swiss bracket is set, or matchups are set. So we're going to be going over why certain teams are seeded the way they are. It might look a little confusing at first, and why the matchups are the way they are. But I think for the most part, it's all pretty positive across the board in terms of trying to avoid rematches and trying to give teams fair seeds. I have some small qualms about it, but let's get right into it. Everyone wants to know what the matchups are for round one of Swiss. So we'll just pop it up right here. It's right behind me. I'll have to dodge a little bit so you guys can see. Let's go down the list and explain why at the end. So first off, and I think probably the match that will be covered, if I had to guess, would be Gen G versus OG, seed 1 versus 15, TSM versus Team Deleted, 2 versus 16, Space Station versus Pirates on a Boat, 3 versus 13, G2 Stride versus the Snowmen, 4-14, Energy versus Young Whippersnappers, 5 and 11, Luminosity versus Plot Twist, 6 to 12, and Dignitas versus Shopify Rebellion, 7 versus 9, and M80 versus the Muffin Men, 8 versus 10. So, first off, let's talk about why it's 1 versus 15, not 1 versus the dead last seed, and so on and so forth. So basically what they did was they took the double Elim qualifiers, and that's how they were kind of seeded. We'll talk about that in a bit. But if you kept it 1 versus, like the worst team, then that very likely happened already in the quarterfinals, I guess you would call it. I'm not really sure what round you call it, in the double Elim portion. So if you went down the line, 8 versus 9, that would have been a rematch. There would have been tons of rematches across the board from what just happened in the qualifiers last week. So just move around a couple seeds and you avoid that. It does make certain matches, I guess, technically stronger. But at the end of the day, with Swiss, after round 1, the seeds don't matter too much. Teams are going to move around a ton. And also round 1 matches, sure, they're important, obviously. Like, everyone wants to get a win. But if you do get a tougher round 1 matchup, like if they're in the same boat as you, you're not going to have to play them later in like that 2-2 round, right? So it might not necessarily benefit you, but it's not going to hurt you as much as you might think. So let's talk about why seeds are the way they are. OG seeded 15, and everyone's like, why is that happening? TSM seeded 2. Well, in the open qualifiers, TSM, they came out of the upper bracket. They took down OG. It runs basically like if you had a normal bracket, like 8-team bracket, right? You have 1 versus 8. On that same side of the bracket, you have 4 versus 5. If the 8 seed beats that 1 seed, well, they just inherit the 1 seed at that point, and they're going to play either seed 4 or 5, whoever comes out, right? They're not going to have to play, like, because now that they're the 8 seed, they're not going to have to play the 2 seed, because that's the highest seed left. We don't reseed in brackets generally, like in the esport. So that is what basically happened. TSM, I think they were actually seeded 18th. They beat the 15th seed at some point. Then they took down OG, who was seeded number 2, and they take over seed number 2. So OG, when they qualified, they are now seed 15. Do I think that's necessarily fair? Like, I don't think it's the worst thing possible, because it's basically they're trying to make it one continuous tournament. I think I would have probably preferred if they just took, all right, here's your top 8 teams that made it through the uppers. Reseed them based on their like initial seed. And then do the same with 9 through 16. Those would come from the lower bracket. Reseed based on their like initial seed. But I would keep the matchups how they are. Because say you did that, you would also get a ton of rematches too. 8 versus 9 would always be a rematch. If TSM took out OG, and if we had the old system, TSM would be seeded 9, or I'm sorry, TSM would be seeded 8 because they would be the lowest seeded team in the uppers, while OG would be seeded 9 because they would be the highest seed out of the lower bracket team. So you would still have that rematch. So you wouldn't want to necessarily put 8 versus 9 anyway, right? You would want to mix and match just slightly. Sure, it does make things weighted a little bit more, but I don't think it's the end of the world. Like 1 versus 15 is obviously a harder matchup than the matchup right below it. 2 versus 16, you add up the seeds, that's 18. 1 versus 15, we all know how to add 16, that's 2 seed spots. So that's just how it's going to be. Like, it'll be a 2 seed difference across all these matches. 3 versus 13 will be a lot harder than 4 versus 13, and so on and so forth. 5 versus 11 versus 6 versus 12, and we keep on going down the line. So that is why they did that, to avoid rematches. And again, I agree with that, because you don't want the same teams playing the same teams all the time. But I do think in the future, like for this first qualifier, I think having like a TSM2 and OG15, it looks weird, but I think they kind of earned it. But as we go along throughout the year, and if we get to, qualifier 5, and you have a team that is like number 1 in points, like a Gen G or something, and they fall down to a lower bracket and then advance out, if they're seeded like 15 or something like that, it's going to look very, very odd, right? And that's going to throw things off a little bit. And I think it hurts them, like that one match where they lose in the upper bracket finals, basically, of that qualifier, hurts them throughout all of Swiss, like a ton, right? Because if they lose their seed, they're going to be dropping to the worst seed in the entire bracket if they were 1, which basically means they lose every single tiebreaker in future rounds of Swiss. So I think that is too big of a punishment. And I do want teams that are lower to have a way to improve their seed, but I think that might be just too much of a drastic change. I think I would have preferred the 8 upper bracket teams being reseeded at that point, and then 9 through 16 being reseeded based on where they started. And I think that would have made probably a little bit more sense. But at the end of the day, it's not a huge deal, because in Swiss, it's kind of chaos anyway. And your matchups, while not predetermined, like your seed doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a harder matchup, because it's just based on how you perform. Like after round 2, most of the time, a lot of the game differential tiebreakers are gone. And also, who knows what matchup is going to go where. And one weird result is going to throw everything off in Swiss. So things will change anyway. So at the end of the day, I love the 1 versus 15 and all that. So there's no rematches. Not a huge fan of just taking the seed steal and just having those teams swap seeds. And I think, again, it doesn't matter as much here, but it will matter later in like a qualifier 5, qualifier 6, like if a top team does fall. At the same time, they shouldn't fall because they're playing weaker competition. So what can you do? But that is it for me here. Swiss round 1 is coming at you on Friday. I believe it starts at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and then we will be following along round 1 all the way through round 5. I think there'll probably be one featured matchup on the broadcast, is my assumption. And we'll do the same thing that we've always done. But I'll be there all day. Normally, I'm not on the Friday shows, but I will be there on the desk and chiming in here or there about all the things going on around the scene during that Swiss. So it's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. All 5 rounds on Friday. Super long show. Chaos will reign supreme. That's going to do it for me. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.